Okay, so Q4. Q4 is what does development look like in second language acquisition? I did mention in the context in the topic on Brightspace that development we have to define the word development unto itself. So we're thinking about development kind of as evidence of acquisition of a particular form, right? And as we go across, we'll see examples from negation, and we'll see examples from verbal morphology, but this applies to more things. Like question formation has a very big piece of that. In fact, it interacts a little bit with negation. Okay, so we're talking about particular linguistic forms and what they look like over time, essentially. So types of development that showed up in this section are stage-like development, ordered development, and I'll give you some clues at the beginning when of each of these slides when I introduce them, what those are. We will then compare and contrast them a little bit tighter in when we meet on Monday. So variation and variability is another version of development. And so instead of having the typical yes, no, maybe, this section, because we're talking about characteristics, things that describe learners as opposed to different approaches to explaining a question, these things can easily co-occur. Okay, so that's why it's not yes, no, maybe. These are things that can happen to the exact same person and pretty much always do. Okay, and you're going to see that how are these different, which we'll talk about. Are the above affected by L1 influence? So is transfer play a role in these things potentially? Are these affected by instruction? And I say ruminate here because questions 2 and 3 we're not going to get into at this moment. But when we refer back to instruction, for example, we can think a little bit more on this. But as in, is there a role of L1 influence? You know, we can talk about this in class too. And like I said, they call them as characteristics. What's the difference between approaches and characteristics? Question 4 here, the answer is what I just told you. These things can co-occur. Approaches suggests that one of them is a more appropriate choice, at least to the person who's chosen an approach. But characteristics do not need to be in opposition of one another. Okay? So stage-like development is our first type of development. It would be described as stages within a phenomenon. The example of negation shows up on page 29, which we'll also see is on, right here. Okay. As to whether they're affected by instruction, again, we could talk more about it in the instruction section, but the claim is that these are not affected by instruction. Okay. So what that means is here we see 4 stages of negation, and we'll read through and see what they are in a second. But the idea would be that these stages would go in this order, and that even if I try to teach you stage 4 before I teach you stage 2, you won't actually learn it. I might show it to you. It might show up in class, but development-wise, it will not be reflected in your language use. Okay? And that's when the question says, are they affected by instruction? That's why they asked this question, because the answer is not really. Okay? So again, this comes from page 29, so when you read, you should have also have seen it, but we'll talk it through real quick. This is negation, right? In English specifically. So it's stage 1, which is the earliest, and this is let's imagine this is a particular learner. We'll call him Paco. Little Paco's learning English, and first when he starts learning negation, he sticks no in front of it and says things like, no, drink beer. No, you eat that. To say no, okay? There's some parallels with child acquisition involved here, but we're not going to unpack that. So if you're also in child language acquisition, you may have seen things kind of like this, or you will, or you won't. I don't know. It's not my class. So you start out, no, drink beer. No, you eat that. And then in the second stage, the subject, the negation moves inside of the sentence, which really means that it's now under the subject in English, right? And so sometimes you also see don't instead of no. So you can say so it looks something like subject no and then the rest of it. I know can do these, I don't can do these, and these examples come from somewhere. Otherwise they wouldn't be so obtuse like these, right? So I'm not sure right now who originally gave these examples. I would think our book would know. Stage 3, appearance of modals, right? So modals like can and should. So before that, you're not seeing them with negation, right? And the attachment of negation to these. Now, this is not saying whether or not you have modals. It's saying whether you're seeing modals with negation. So now, instead of like So notice how in the beginning, in stage 2, there is a can, so you had a modal, but it's in a weird spot. Whereas in stage 3, now we have can smushed together with our negation. So I can't do that one. So it's starting to sound more like an adult native speaker, for example. And then in stage 4, suddenly we can use do. And so that predicts that do is a pretty late acquired thing. And partially it's because do doesn't carry its own meaning really. Certainly not when there's negation attached to it, right? And so notice that it's an analyzed do in stage 4. So you can see it where it's inflected for person, it's inflected for tense, right? She didn't like that one. He doesn't need it, right? They're also doing it the phonological smushing where you get the contractions and everything. So anyway, stage-like development. These are 4 stages that have been observed by more than one person about what negation looks like in learners. And you have stage 1 at the beginning and stage 4 towards the end. You know, you get more and more adult native-like towards the end. Okay? Now, something about stage-like development is that when you're in a stage, a particular stage can exhibit U-shaped development. I'm going to actually go beyond that and say that I see U-shaped development in my learners regardless of whether it's associated with stages or not. This is a pretty typical thing, gender assignment. If you have a language with gender in it, like the he versus her, except for in the thes, so the he versus the her kind of stuff, you see this where you're like, I can do it, I really can't do it, and then I can again, right? So it looks like this, right? So imagine here on the right, and I hypothesize this, you're welcome. I made this up as data, this isn't real data, but it would look something like this. Across the bottom on the x-axis, you see number of semesters of study, and on the y-axis, you see accuracy out of 100% on some test, let's say. And so in the first semester, let's imagine I've taught you how to do, I don't know, something that, so like the versus the book, a book. Just imagine with me for a second. And in the first semester, you learn it, you go, okay, I can do it, that's fine. And then in semester 2, you're like, well, I kind of remember that stuff. Semester 3, you're like, I'm so distracted with verbs right now, I have no idea about the and. And then semester 4, you've been reading some more and your brain goes, oh, no, hang on. We know how to do this. And then in semester 5, it looks good, right? So, so when you're talking about U-shaped development, and I ask, what does this possibly mean? So now I'm back on the bullets on the left side. So the learner's production of a given form starts out correct, and it's pretty much incorrect, and then it's correct again, right? Again, this is with a particular form. That's why we're in development. And it's potentially, this is according to the book, and I don't think it's totally unreasonable, it's potentially related to moving from fossilized chunks. You know, like I've learned the book and a sandwich, right? My brain goes, well, the is a thing that we would do. It's more common to say the with a book, right? And a sandwich, you know, I eat lots of sandwiches, so it's probably just right? So this is a strange example, but just imagine that that's what we're trying to say. And so the brain has it chunked out, and as you learn more examples, those chunks start to fail you, right? There's examples where suddenly you have to say the sandwich or whatever, and your brain doesn't really keep track anymore. And then finally, it starts incorporating it back into the system. Now, you can imagine this also with negation, which we just saw, because when it says that U-shaped happens within stages, it's like saying you started stage 4 with the analyzed doesn't and didn't. When you first, are learning it, you go, oh, okay, I can use it like this, I can use it like this, great. And then as you start to, as you go on from there over time, you get less accurate, in part because you have more contexts or you're not thinking about it or whatever. And then eventually your brain goes, oh, no, I understand what we're doing. And it incorporates in the linguistic system and it comes back for real, right? It's almost like that first correct is correct superficially. That's kind of the idea. So we see U-shaped development in general, but especially within the stages of stage-like development. Okay. Now, ordered development, and I think so. One of the challenges of this question is keeping straight which one's stage, what is stage, and what is ordered. And so, ordered development is a different acquired pieces of something, with common orders across learners, and these are not in stages. So I'm going to show you some examples which will make my explanation better. This comes from page 30 of our book. So for example, if I'm a learner of English and I'm learning verbs, towards the beginning, I learned something like the ing of walking and running. And then sometime after that, I learned to do the past tense ed, okay? And I can say walked. And then I learned, hey, there's actually some irregular past tenses. Oh, I see, I see. I can say ran now because it's not runned, it's ran. Probably before that, I'm just doing runned. And then finally, I mastered third person S. And I'm going to ask you in class, what order do you actually expect? Looking at these based upon as being a native speaker or near native speaker or someone who knows English, or some of you might not English might not be your first language. You might have an insight into this the rest of us don't. But I'm going to ask you about this in class. So the idea when I say different acquired pieces with common orders across learners, right? What I'm saying is that all of these things you're looking at, these morphemes, all of them pertain to English verbal morphology, but they're different. It's not like they're all types of past tense. There are two types of past tense here, but there's also progressive. There's also the third person S, which is a present tense morpheme. So it's not like, it's not like you would expect you have to know ing to be able to do past tense. It's not like they relate in some close way. It just so happens that when we're learning verbs, we have a tendency to see things in this order. So this kind of points back to the morpheme order studies we talked about in the intro, that sometimes there are patterns of morphemes that come out in a certain order, okay? So these are different pieces in sort of a bucket, as opposed to stages of one thing. These are order development of different pieces, and it's usually morphology, okay? Related types of morphology, okay? So you really need to be able to explain it with regards to this in particular, okay? These particular four morphemes are, irregular past tenses. To call it a morpheme is to simplify a bit, but whatever. But this essential order of four types of morphemes, this explanation, as long as you can do it, you're good, okay? If you can tell me essentially stage-like in terms of negation and ordered in terms of these four verbal morphemes, you're okay, okay? Because generalizing to a broader thing involves a lot more brain power in some sense, and examples that we're not going to spend the time to go through. But this is on page 30, okay? So order development, different pieces within a general phenomenon that aren't building necessarily on each other in a way that the stages do, but just happen to come out in a certain order. Notice I've said here, progressive ing precedes regular past tense, which precedes irregular past tense, which precedes third person S. Okay, so although I will ask you in class about what you would have guessed would be the order, let's talk a little bit about why people think this is the order when it happens, okay? So according to some approaches, such as Goldschneider and De Keyser 2001, the order that you see in order development is related to factors such as frequency, salience, reliability of form-function mapping, etc. Frequency is, of course, number of times you see it. How often do you see it? Salience. When we talk about salience, we mean sort of how easy it is to notice it, right? If we say something is very salient, it's eye-catching, essentially, right? Or, there's the auditory and then there's the signing version, and you could be reading it, whatever, okay? Salient. Colors are salient sometimes too. Bright red in a presentation usually grabs your eye. It makes stuff more salient, okay? And we talk about input salience will reappear for this reason. Reliability of form-function mapping. So what that means is form-function mapping is how many the relationship between a form, like a particular morpheme, and its meanings, okay, or what it's doing in the sentence. So in the case of S, and this is why it's a really big one for this, the S on an end of a verb, or S in general really, in English has a heck ton of uses. A heck ton more than ing, right? Ing is I'm progressive, right? Or I guess you could be like a subject, walking is hard or easy or whatever. But, ing has very few uses. It has basically one major one and then a backup for talking about actions. But S, we have the verbal S, we have S of plural, we have S of possession, and these are all frequent S's, no less. So the reliability of when I see an S, let's imagine I'm not good at picking out verbs. That S, I'm like, wait, is that a plural S? Is it a possessive? Is that third person singular? right? That's a problem when it comes to the S, the morpheme, because it looks the same on the surface, even though underneath that S does different things, right? So the reliability of form function mapping for S is pretty low. In addition to the fact that, I mean, it's frequent, right? So if we look at this list, the reliability of form function mapping for the S is low because it does a bunch of things, but it's also not very salient. Imagine you're doing, again, talking about English, so auditory, for example. This at the end of a verb is very subtle. Yeah, he walks to the store. That's small, right? The ED kind of suffers from that too a little bit, but the ED is at least more reliable. And as far as frequency goes, I mean, the ing is frequent. It is salient. It's ing, and it's pretty much always progressive. So I mean, so what we're trying to get at, therefore, is that the farther down we get, now these are all fairly, I mean, the irregulars are not as frequent, but these are all fairly frequent. But the most salient one is at the top. The most reliable ones are in the top half. Like that's what's supposed to be driving this development, okay? So as I said, so when this is in the PowerPoint if you're studying later, under this approach, verbal S is competing with plural S and possessive S, so it's more difficult to acquire and master. And again, I might think, honestly, those are very different, and they are. But if I'm really bad with word categories, it would take me a while, in addition to the salience issues. Now, in particular, if you remember, Lardiere, who I actually referenced last week too, her learner Patty still struggles at the end of the book with verbal morphology, and a big culprit is that S at the end of the verb. It is really, really, really hard to do that consistently, okay? Because it's not salient and it's pretty unreliable, okay? The last type of characteristics is under the large bucket of variation and variability. There are some sub-things under that, okay? Free variation versus systematic variation is one of those. So free variation is something, so various stages of development have what we call free variation. And what that is, two or more variants used in the same context. So no look versus don't look, as we saw in the second stage of negation, is one of these, right? They're in free variation. You're not using one or the other for particular purposes. You're just saying, I no look, I don't look, indiscriminately, okay? Whereas systematic variation is a different kind, right? It's where we use variants in different contexts. There's an example in our book, right? Again, from negation, where I'm not sure which stage this is supposed to be. It looks like it is towards the end. But imagine someone has mastered, they say, no look for, I'm not going to do it. Like, no, look, no look. And I don't know versus like lack of knowledge, right? Like, I don't know, right? So in this case, the person's using one for one type of verb and one for another. So systematic, again, if you don't totally understand the distinction here from Schachter, that's okay. But the idea is that you're using it in one context to mean one thing and one context to mean others. You're taking two variants that are related, like no and don't, and using them for different purposes in the same stage, okay? I'm trying to remember, I think it was in the intro that we discussed we talked about the pro stuff, the option. Oh, no, it was in the parameter section. We were talking about whether or not you had to use a pronoun in Italian, and that some learners continued to use it even though, because it was an option, right? So that would be free variation, whereas native speakers use the pronoun for particular usage, so they have a very systematic variation. Okay, we can look at some more examples of this in class if that's not clear, okay? All right, one of the questions, I like how I said we were going to talk about the questions, but here we are anyway. I apparently just don't have my brain on straight. So first language influence. The order of acquisition, as we mentioned, was not affected by instruction. It's also not affected by your first language. So it is not the case that the stages are different, right? It's not like you go stage 1, 3, 4, 2 if your first language is Chinese, and stage 1, 2, 4, 3 if your first language is Japanese or whatever, right? The actual stages are not in their order changed by what your first language is. But that being said, the ease of acquisition can be. So when I say here ease, I'm kind of referring, and this is not a technical term, I'm just trying to explain what I mean. When I say ease, I mean it might make more sense to you, a particular stage, because it's more like your first language. So you might go through it faster. And that's actually the same claim you would make for instruction. You know, instruction is not going to change the order whatsoever, but it might speed you through it a little bit. As for order of acquisition not affected by L1, but might be eased a little bit, let's look at German versus Chinese with the verbal S that we already discussed. German has a heck ton of verbal morphology and Chinese has basically none. And this is the claim made on page 32. So German learners may arrive to a stage where they actively produce S more quickly than someone who speaks a language that doesn't really have verbal morphology, such as Lardiere's Patty, right? Had a lot more challenge because Patty spoke several languages, many of which did not have a very much verbal morphology, whereas German, again, has a ton. And so in this case, the learners are kind of, in a way, they're paying more attention because their brain is already wired to go, no, verbal morphology matters, probably more so than even in English. They might even be overthinking it, who knows, right? So this is the kind of claim that is made, again, on page 32, for example. This is the kind of claim that we made for ease of acquisition based on L1. So you're not literally transferring the form, but the idea might come from your L1. You might be looking for stuff if your expectation is that it functions like your L1. Okay? All right, so our authors, their assessment of this particular question is this. Acquisition orders are well documented, but not well understood. Yeah, it's true. There may be a role for processability, which they didn't get into too much during this question, right? So the ease of linking a form with a meaning might be involved, right? So it might be really easy for me to imagine what the ing means. Like, oh yeah, I need something for progressive, cool. But it's less easy for me to imagine what the verbal S means because it's just marking third person singular and we do such little marking of person in our verbal paradigm that it's like, oh, I don't know what it's doing. A thing? I don't know. Okay. And so again, with related to that, factors such as frequency studies, reliability, form, function mapping, and so on might affect ease of acquisition at any particular stage. Okay, and this piggybacks on the Goldschneider de Kaiser that we already mentioned. Okay, and I have nothing to add to this. I think that this is all completely reasonable. The variance variability stuff, free versus systematic, you would want to know the difference, basically. You can think to phonology too. That same kind of thing happens in phonology, right? That some sounds are interchanged just for kicks and some are exchanged based upon the context, right? But yeah, okay. As always, if you have questions, let me know and we will talk in